for both adjudicators and debaters is pretty much the same when it comes to note-taking. It's basically ensuring that you're able to track the debate that you're in. And for debaters, it's such that you're able to win the debate. For adjudicators, it's such that you're able to award the debate to someone. The ways in which we track debates differ based on the kind of skill sets that we have as individuals. What I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to break down how I do it and how perhaps a few other people have done it over a certain a lengthy period of time, and the different strategies that I've heard of since I've started adjudicating as well as debating, and how those have either worked or not worked. This will ultimately allow you to be able to pick something that works for you, but also allows you to be able to give both speakers and speakers and adjudicators that you're going to be adjudicating with or speaking against the necessary respect when it comes to the kind of matter that they bring into debates. Cool. So the first thing to note when note-taking for a debate is twofold. One, it's that in order for you to be able to effectively note-take in adjudication, as well as in speaking, you are required to listen. But this is not such that you're able to respond only as a speaker. I'm going to start with just speakers, and then I'm going to go to adjudication so that it's easier to track. As a speaker, you need to be able to note-take, not just to respond, but such that you understand the matter that is being presented to you, such that those responses are effective. That means that each argument that is given by speakers within the room has to be understood in the way in which it is intended to be utilized by those very speakers, such that you're able to understand, one, the conclusion of that argument, but two, what it is that that type of argument is ultimately based on. The way in which we do this is through, one, tracking what the initial claim of the argument is. What is it that this particular speaker is trying to prove when making a certain argument? Most debaters will give this to you. They will tell you that by the time you get to the end of this particular argument, I seek to prove A, B, and C, and I'm going to be using the following argument to do so. Some debaters might not do that, and that too is something that you're able to track if you're listening to what it is that their opening ideas are when it comes to that particular set of argumentation. Follow that up then with what is it that they utilize to substantiate that particular claim. So a debater will tell you that it is important for us to take up a utilitarian perspective, and that a utilitarian perspective for that particular motion is something that ultimately benefits everyone. That's the initial idea and what they're going with when they're trying to prove to you that utilitarianism actually works. How they go about proving that is going to then be what you need to track next. You need to track the reasoning behind why we need to value utility in that particular sense, and why that then becomes a significantly important thing when it comes to the debate that you're having at that point in time. The value of tracking the reasoning behind those arguments is because that reasoning often is often what is going to determine the conclusion of the argument itself, but it also determines whether or not the argument is impactful in the way in which it plays out in that sense. So if you're able to track the initial claim, the reasons behind that particular claim that they utilize to substantiate it, you're then able to track how it makes an impact in the debate, and you're therefore able to respond either to the value of those reasons and how far we're able to establish whether or not we ought to be giving any value to them in the debate. And you're also able to track whether or not they ultimately get you to the kind of impact or conclusion that they would be looking for. That is just one way in which it directly engages your ability to engage a debate when you note take effectively. Secondly, then, when it comes to note-taking as a speaker, you also want to be able to ensure that you can track the way in which responses to your own argumentation are being made. This comes in the form of points of information. It comes in the form of some kind of rebuttal that is being done during specific speeches. And it also comes in the form of extensions that may come from your closing half. those extensions can either be, especially when they're analytical in nature, have the potential to take the substance of that argument to being one that is better understood, or even being one that is better elaborated upon when it comes to the closing half of the debate. Tracking that means that you're able to utilize things like points of information to try and establish your case, or even show why it is that a significant portion of what is being argued in the bottom half ultimately relies on the matter that you're bringing forth. How we do this in terms, well, how I've done this in terms of adjudication, and no, I'm the kind of judge or speaker that prefers to utilize pen and paper because it's easier to navigate between pieces of paper than it is to navigate between sheets on a laptop. And I think that's something that ultimately works out for me. What I've come to realize is that I need to be able to track points of information. This is as a judge or as a speaker. I need to be able to track what the point of information was in order for me to understand the substance of that point of information in relation to my argumentation. Because sometimes debaters will ask you a very random seeming question, but that ultimately has an important role in how it establishes itself when it comes to things like extensions or even just general matter creation in the first half of the debate. So you want to always be aware of what you're being asked and how you're responding to it. And that's one of the few things that I always hold to be of importance. Secondly, I always want to track offensive pieces of rebuttal that seek to directly engage any of the matter that I brought forth. In doing so, I want to be able to track what is the substance of the challenge that is being given to me. Is that challenge a direct question of whether or not I'm able to reach the conclusions of that argument in a way that is sufficient? Or is it a substantive claim that argues that my premises are incorrect? And so you want to be able to ensure that you can respond to that kind of thing in a way that ultimately is going to ensure that whatever responses you're being given to your initial matter don't necessarily substantively affect the value of the arguments that you bring forth. Now, in terms of like practically doing this, then I've got two ways in which I do it. The first is assuming I'm in the opening half of the debate and I'm trying to engage the opening half before I get to the closing half, or even before we're able to figure out what the closing half is going to run. Normally, what I would do is I would split my notebook paper in half so that I have the ability to track all of the initial arguments that I intended to run, while tracking all of the arguments that have been run in relation to them. What I do with this is that I often color code them based on what is being utilized to respond to these particular arguments and what has been effective to some degree in being able to maybe create some doubt on the argument or devalue its initial impact, right? So what happens then is that you have on the one side of your sheet your argumentation and what you sought to argue for that particular debate. So most of this is going to be done during your prep time because you're in the opening half of the debate. So basically you will have prepped, unless of course you missed the entire motion and only find out what it's actually about at opening government. That's a whole different chat, and I'm going to get into how you're able to note take for something like that as well in a bit, right? On the other end then would be all the argumentation that's been used to respond to what's here. The difference would be that this is coded, the initial argumentation that you have is coded based on what you're trying to prove on each end. And on the other side, you use the same type of color coding to establish what seeks to respond to what. Of course, not all the argumentation that is going to be made in the opening half seeks to directly engage your own. Some pieces of matter are just simply trying to prove the side that is currently speaking and not necessarily seeking to clash. And that sometimes can happen, especially in instances where a particular team just simply has a lot more matter than what the team that's spoken before them does. What happens in those instances then is that outside of the originally color-coded pieces of matter, you would have a separate section for anything that is completely new, that doesn't in any way clash, and therefore you wouldn't have to substantiate on, but instead would have to start a whole new type of responsive matter to. You want to always be aware of what is new and what you need to respond to in it being new. And you also want to be aware about what it is that you need to ensure is going to, you need to defend yourself against, because it's absolutely matter that seeks to be offensive towards your own. The importance of all of this then for a speaker specifically is that in order for you to be able to win a debate, you need to be able to track that debate. And tracking a debate, specifically in instances where we're talking about being in the opening half, means that you also need to be able to track what comes from the closing half, often in pieces of information, or sometimes for those instances where tournaments do allow speakers to headline their points of information, what those headlines sound like and what they could potentially be alluding to. I've already said to you that what normally happens is that you would have on one end your own argumentation, on the other end what seeks to directly engage that, and whatever else is new in a completely different code of color. There also needs to be a section that tracks those points of information and the responses that have been given to those points of information, because you can then try to preempt some of the matter that's going to come from the closing half in a way that ultimately seeks to ensure that you remain relevant throughout the rest of the debate, because the relevance of matter is not purely based on whether or not the matter is good or bad, even though that's an important element. There's also the discussion about whether or not it remains something that's of significant importance in the debate, such that it sways the kind of issues that become central to the debate as well. Of course, that's not to say that matter that is not necessarily important to the debate itself is something that's going to be carrying significant weight. It's simply to say that you want to ensure that you've got some kind of coverage of the most important matters of a particular piece of argumentation or a particular motion. In the closing half of the debate, similar to adjudication, you are required to track the debate in a way that broadly views what the biggest pieces of matter and biggest issues of the debate are in the opening half, and what they ultimately become when you get to the end of the debate. This is even more so important for whip speakers, because as a whip speaker, your requirements are extremely high when it comes to having to respond to pieces of matter that are in the debate, while also establishing differentiation between yourself and your opening half. What I normally do when I speak at whip is, for each speech in the debate, I take my notes in a slightly different way to what I initially showed. And the way in which this works is that I have a page that I've sectioned in 4 specific ways, all of which have some kind of importance, right? The sections are as follows. The first section is where all of the matter that is being given by a particular speaker goes, right? Then this is followed through by a section that vertically goes down the page. This section covers all of the things that I need to respond to as a whip speaker, because all of these particular things that show up on this end are things that determine whether or not the pieces of matter that have been brought about by my member are going to still remain important once judges get to deliberation. These are things that are offensive rebuttal. These are things that might be new matter that comes up in member speeches that directly jeopardizes the value of my case, or they could just be competing principles that seek to ultimately engage in a way that is going to take from my particular case. There's also a last secondary section, well, 2 more sections rather. The second last section is at the bottom of the page. That too is meant for points of information, responses to those points of information, and what the impact of that is. Because for you to track points of information, you need to be able to ensure that whatever response is given to the points of information is, one, not contradictory to the argumentation that's being made, but two, is of the kind of substance that is going to ensure that if it is in fact something that directly seeks to contrast any of your matter, it cannot devalue it to a point where it is not going to be able to hold weight when it comes to the deliberations that are going to be had. Lastly, then, this tiny little section at the end here, this is where you put in things like last minute considerations of matter that you need to reestablish. So there is basically things like, what do you need to rehash? What do you need judges to understand that may have not come out as strongly from your member speech, may not have come out as strongly from the side that you're going to be speaking on. I use a very similar sort of approach when it comes to adjudication as well. However, they do slightly differ in terms of the way in which each section is ultimately then going to be used. This then says two things to me. One, it's that note-taking for speakers is probably just as important as note-taking for adjudicators, because it, one, establishes the amount of understanding that you have of the matter that is being brought about in the debate. But two, it also means that you're able to remind yourself of things that have taken place in the debate, even in the instance where all of the different things that are coming in have started to create some kind of flustering. You can still be able to track yourself in terms of where it is that you need to be and what it is that you need to respond to. This is incredibly important because people who have the kind of memory that allows them to be able to regurgitate anything that has been said to them are probably not debating for the most part, because, well, debating just kind of takes, excuse me, sorry about that. Debating just requires you to remember so many different things because you can't look on the net for certain things. And so that requirement is ultimately something that means that you need to supplement it with something in order for you to be able to successfully win debates, or even just successfully be able to track a particular round that you're in. Anyone who doesn't need to do that probably isn't in this room and probably isn't trying to figure out whether or not note-taking and debating is going to be something that ultimately makes them successful. Note-taking for adjudicators, like I said at the beginning, has a slightly different objective. The objective is not to respond, but the objective is to ensure that you know what has been said, how it has been said, what its impact is, and whether or not it places someone first, second, third, or fourth. Or if you're doing schools, then is it going to be win or loss for prop or op? Obviously, some of the more important things will probably have been covered in different sessions where they talk about things like what it is that each speech is required to do. And those things I'm not going to go into because that's not what we're here for, right? But you need to be able to track what is required of speakers while tracking what it is that they're doing. This is not to say that them not following those requirements in the way that you set them up is a loss, or them doing so is an automatic win. There's no such thing as an automatic first, no such thing as an automatic fourth, second, or third for that matter. Everyone kind of has to fight for their spot. But the value of understanding what each speech technically is required to do is that every time you track a particular aspect of the speech, you're able to track it in accordance to what it's supposed to ultimately do, right? You're able to track where where the prime minister or leader of opposition is trying to set context. You're able to track where the prime minister is showing you what kind of definitions ought to exist in that particular debate. You're able to track the extent to which they're able to differentiate between framing and argumentation in that way as well. The importance then of the same structure that I showed you for a whip speech is that the bigger portion of the sheet, if you're someone who uses paper like I do, or the bigger portion of the document sheet, if you're somebody who uses a laptop or whatever other electronic device you would do your note-taking on, is that it picks out all of the substantive argumentation that is being made by a particular speaker. This is inclusive of rebuttal. This is inclusive of general new matter that they're bringing into the debate. Because the importance of rebuttal is that most speakers use rebuttal interchangeably with new matter, especially in instances where the rebuttal itself integrates itself to a significant portion of their matter, which is why all of this happens on the same sort of space, because it ultimately means that they're very likely going to chip into those bits of argumentation. Again, the bottom end is something that you're going to be using to track your points of information, something that you're going to be using to track the responses to those points of information, so that you also have an understanding of what those responses will ultimately mean as the rest of the debate unfolds. Because what often happens with debates is that points of information that are asked earlier on are then used to substantiate pieces of argumentation, or even used to substantiate contradictions that have been picked out by the opposing teams at the point where those responses were given to those points of information. Right? What you then have on the last end here, the vertical end, where there initially would be things like things that you need to respond to, etc., is you have clashes that you have established to exist as a result of that particular speech, right? So if the Prime Minister's speech was based on the value of the protection of human rights in whatever motion they were talking about, right? And that particular right that they were talking about was maybe something like the right to privacy. If the direct response from the leader of opposition is a discussion about why there has to be some kind of evaluation of metric when we're talking about the right to privacy, especially in the instance where that very privacy is something that ultimately potentially harms a certain other grouping of individuals, because it directly allows these individuals to carry out horrible deeds or whatever the case may be. That is a direct issue that they're clashing on, that ultimately needs to be decided by the adjudicators as to which side is better able to prove what they're trying to do in this debate, and therefore wins that particular clash. If you're able to track clashes as they happen, if you're able to track issues as they're being debated, you're then better able to ensure that you can understand what each team's contribution to those clashes is going to look like. Because if the clash happens in, say, Prime Minister, and it is something that is carried through to opposition whip, it is going to show up on all of your pages for all of the speakers, right? And the importance of that is that you're then able to see what has been said by this particular team in relation to this, and how does it affect what's been said earlier, and whether or not it ultimately then beats that out, right? The last bit of this page is obviously what you as an adjudicator are going to need, which is your scoring, right? Scoring is almost always going to be based on the scale. In fact, it's always going to be based on the scale that a particular tournament is going to be using. For the most part, we use the WWGMO scale in order for us to be able to establish what a particular speaker is going to be able to score. Importantly then, when doing the necessary weigh up for all of these things, if you're able to track what the arguments are, what they're able to prove, and how that ultimately engages the clashes that have been set out, that's when you're going to be able to explain why it is, one, a doubt is sufficient to be able to take down a particular argument, or why a mitigation of a particular argument isn't enough, or even why that one argument may not have substantially been engaged and therefore has not been lost out in a particular round. This is important because in your ability to effectively engage the setup argumentation as an adjudicator, you're best able to ensure that, one, you can effectively track what people are saying, what its value is, but you can also explain it when you're doing oral adjudication. Oral adjudication note taking is a little bit different, right? The note taking for oral adjudication happens during deliberation for the chair, because as the chair, you are required to give an overview of the discussion that has taken place between you and all of the adjudicators that are in that particular deliberation. Oral adjudication is not the chairperson's idea of what happened in the debate, but rather a collective discussion that they then give a report for, right? This is the same even in instances where there are splits. We sometimes ask the judges that split to give a little bit of an explanation of why they split. But for the most part, this is something that can be done by the chairperson if they're able to take the necessary, if they're doing their note taking properly during deliberation. How note taking during deliberation can work is two ways. The first is you can do a clash-based note taking where each adjudicator's ideas on how a particular clash worked or how a particular clash can be resolved are basically set out in one part of your notes. So you would note the clash itself, what their reasoning behind giving it to whatever team they gave it to is, and how they were able to call that. And that can be for all of those clashes, and then you just collate that and use it for your OA. Or you can do it in a way, and I think this is what most adjudicators do, is that they have a discussion about the debate in general, and the adjudicators will tell you what they think each team got right and how it is that that ultimately placed them in a position where they ranked above the other. For splits, you always want to ensure that you have a sheet that is separate for splits, so that you're able to track the split without diluting the value of what a particular judge holds to be of importance. When you put notes of your split in the same notes where the majority have voted, you're often going to, it's very likely that you're going to neglect the split when you're giving your OA, because it's easier as a judge to follow the OA of something that you necessarily believe in. This is exactly why chairs don't have to give feedback in instances where they've been rolled, because it's particularly important to ensure that whatever feedback is going to be given is going to be of quality. So you can either track it via the clashes that are going to be made and brought about in the debate, or you can track it on the basis of what has been said in terms of reasons for awarding the debate in the way that judges have. But in all instances, ensure that you have a separate sheet that you're going to be using for the split, so that you're best able to explain it in the instance where you're not going to be able to ask your wing who has split to be able to give that kind of explanation. This is obviously something that hardly ever happens, because most of the time wings are available to give their decision in the instance where they do split. However, every now and then you just want to make sure that you have access to that kind of information. This is also something that ultimately allows you to be able to give personal feedback as well, because when, as an adjudicator, you have what I've shown you is a metric of sort of taking notes for each speech, you also have the ability to track what a speaker has done right and what a speaker needs to work on in order for them to be able to get the kind of speaks that they would ultimately desire, right? What you're doing there is that every time you track the argument, you're also able to track what links are missing. you're also able to track things like what could potentially have been better in terms of the argumentation that they make. And therefore, you're able to ensure that you can give substantive advice when it comes to giving feedback individually to speakers when they ask for personal feedback. I think this is the point where I would be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, I had a question.
Sure.
When you're being LO and when you're being a member, like when you're LO, if you have to listen to Prime Minister and you have to write down the rebuttal as you hear, right? But in prep time, as a novice, you didn't have enough time to like write down all your points clearly. So how do you cope with that kind of situation? Like you have to do a certain amount of substantiation to your speech and also integrate rebuttal, otherwise your partner will get into trouble. So how do you do that?
So this is something that obviously needs quite a bit of practice, but what I found works is being able to use shorthand when you're doing your prep sessions, because during your prep sessions, you're having discussions with your partner about the matter that you're going to be bringing through. That means that during that time, somebody is explaining something, you're explaining it, there is a little bit more engagement with that matter than what happens when you're inside the debate and somebody's speaking and you're trying to track them. So for the time where you're going to be doing your preps, your prep time or whatever the case may be, try and use shorthand to be able to get your matter down. Even if it means you're just noting what is it that you're trying to prove, what are you using to prove it, and what your conclusion is going to be, so that you're better able to listen and track the Prime Minister's speech as leader of opposition. Because that speech determines the direction of the debate, but it also determines the value of some of the matter that you're going to bring about, because it's going to be contrasted against it. So I would say two things. One, try shorthand, and then two, ensure that you're listening to the first speech, the Prime Minister's speech, in a way that if it directly clashes with anything that may have spoken about, you can note it next to those things that you will have necessarily sought to talk about it anyway, and that way integration becomes a little bit easier because your color coding tells you what your initial argument is anyway going to be responding to. Is that clear, or do you need a little bit more in terms of that?
No, that was enough. But when you like a specific speakers, like I am a first speaker by practice, and I've done it a lot. So when I'm doing second speeches, it becomes really problematic because it's like when I'm integrating rebuttal, then my first speaker have already done a rebuttal, and then it becomes a repetition, and I all like writing it down is a bit more painful, like you have to change your rebuttal and then again you have to say it. But in a lot of instances I've seen that the rebuttals are like on the same wavelength, like it's not a totally different rebuttal. So when you're doing that kind of thing, so how do you efficiently write it down as a novice, and how do and as well as a novice edge as well, like it becomes problematic when you're edge and you are confused like whether or not you should like write that rebuttal down or not, and valued as a substantiate valued as something as a contribution for that team.
Okay, so let's start with you as a speaker, right? As a speaker, I said earlier that the objective of a speaker when they're tracking a debate is to win it, right? And so in the instance where there is a rebuttal that has been done for a particular argument, you want to establish what that rebuttal wants to achieve, right? Are you rebutting that particular argument on the basis that it is on principle something that is less than desirable, or are you rebutting it because there's an element of an outcome that is not met, right? So you need to know what it is that you're responding, that has been responded to, and so what has been done by the speaker before you to try and reestablish that argument. Because what you would then have to respond to would usually not be the same thing as your partner, right? Because if you can establish what your partner responded to, you then can establish what the newer sort of understanding that has been set up by the following speaker who sought to defend would be, and therefore can respond to that defense to ensure that you can then maintain the value of the argument that's been made. But the way you note take this is that, remember initially I told you about color coding and why that color coding is important. That color coding also establishes two other things. It establishes what your initial claim was when you sought to respond to that argument. If the argument says that there's a need for the protection of a particular right, if your direct response is that that right is an infringement on several other people's rights, and therefore it probably wouldn't be a good idea to maintain that, it then becomes important for you to note that that's what you're trying to prove, right? But secondary to that would be, what is it that you were able to do in terms of substantively proving that, and how does it affect the other argument? If you can track that, and normally it would just literally take you a few arrows, it would take you understanding the initial claim, the conclusion thereof, and how you get to it. And it would also take you having to note what the following speaker says in response to what your argument was. As an adjudicator, you take very similar steps. However, the difference is that you want to listen for whether or not speakers are changing the substance of their rebuttal, right? So one person can say, we think we value the ability to benefit more people than a singular person by the protection of a particular right. And therefore, we think that that benefit is substantially more important to a government, for example. A second speaker can come back and say, the value of this particular action is that it ultimately allows us to be able to pull out even more value because it is substantively greater in its reach. These are the exact two things, same things. These two things are exactly the same. They just said in different language. You need to be able to track the difference between substantive and language, because when you write these things down, you need to write them with the understanding of how they are intended to be argued. So speakers who say we want to amass a greater benefit are saying the exact same thing as it covers a greater scope, because that exact same thing is basically a greater benefit. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you very much. And sorry if my question was really roundabout.
No, I got it. I've had to make similar adjustments, so that's okay. Anyone else? I saw a hand. Just unmute and speak.
So when note taking for the second speaker, when you find a possible rebuttal in the other person's, the opposition speech, how do you note it down such that it also integrates with your existing points and does not, go haywire on your paper?
That's largely going to be determined by the argument itself, right? So you can't make something integrate unless it actually integrates. The argument is going to determine whether or not you already have something that responds to it. And if you don't already have anything that responds to it, you then have to come up with something that's going to respond to it. Note taking only tracks that you have clashing ideas. It doesn't make things clash automatically. Sometimes debates are going to be parallel, and that can't necessarily be changed via whether or not you have a great note-taking technique, but rather is determined by the substance of the argumentation itself. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, it doesn't look like we have anyone else. Are there any questions from the organizers? If not, then I think I will have come to the end of my session.